What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoners Rift Team's live pod. Here to talk about patch 14.9. Indeed, preamble, this is the post-MSI patch. MSI is happening in, a week and a half or something at this point in time. May 1st, whenever that is, relative to where it is right now. About a week, whatever. Anyway, this means we are no longer beholden to pro play changes. We've got a little bit of time, and so some of what we're doing is some amount of unpro jailing. Also, we are now throwing in a whole bunch of nerfs. So this is a nerf patch, which I'll call out here. Two things going on here. One, acknowledging that we've been pretty buff heavy over the last couple of patches, and so basically the first thing we slotted for this patch was make good on that and slot in a whole bunch of nerfs to things that we've been either dragging our heels on intentionally or just kicked down the line because other things were higher priority. Generally speaking, when choosing to nerf things, there's a couple things going on. One is that there is some value in game-to-game variance. So even if a champion like Twitch or Kog'Maw is overpowered, and we yep, these champions are definitely overpowered, the fact that they're in 2, 3, 4% of games means that even though they are overpowered, they're less, I don't know, obnoxious than like Jinx who's overpowered or Zeri who's overpowered because they're in way, way, way more games. And so the urgency is lower because the literal player impact is lower, just straight up. Two, you can even just say that it's worth, even if you had infinite time, there was an argument. I think it's a fairly weak argument, but it is an argument that has some teeth to it, which is letting them be OP for a little bit, just because then, again, promotes some game-to-game variance, and it's not just every game is Jinx, Ezreal, Misfortune, and Kai'Sa, right? Just like having more than 4 champions is a positive, just like strictly in League of Legends the game. There's an argument there. You can't do it for a very long time, but I think it's okay to have for some amount of time. The urgency argument, I think, is very compelling. The game-to-game variance argument is okay, sort of is how I feel about it, though it is one that I will defend to some degree because I think there's validity there. And then the other one that's more important than point 2 is actually player perception, where ultimately there's plenty of things that we'll see as overpowered and know or believe it is overpowered, but until players believe it, it's going to look like, what the hell's Riot doing? Why are you doing this? And so there's a certain amount of inbuilt lag guaranteed if we're going to do our jobs correctly, which is wait for players to identify it. So in the case of Twitch, for example, Twitch's been really, really high win rate for a very, very long time. Kog'Maw's been really, really high win rate for a little while. I mean, we buffed him a little while back, and he's been like 53, 54% win rate for several patches. And it's like, okay, well, if the play rate doesn't go anywhere and the ban rate doesn't go anywhere, then no one cares what this champ's win rate is. And until that ban rate and that win rate move, players don't seem to care. Why would we spend our time doing this? Doesn't have an effect on, the player perception of the game. In sort of broad strokes, right? Not exactly every single situation here. Anyway, TLDR, this patch started out as, hey, let's go after a broad set of nerfs to make good on all the excessive buffs we had. Now, by the end of the patch, we also added some buffs in, so we're probably still like net champion change, more buffs than nerfs over the last couple of patches, but it's like, we're +4 buffs compared to nerfs. Like, it's not huge, right? Just kind of being clear about that we might have been slightly buff heavy over the last 6 weeks, but like not to extreme point now that we've made these changes here. Okay, let's move forward into how the last patch. So first of all, how the last patch was. First of all, we actually had several micro patches, or 1 or 2 micro patches. Anyway, first of all, Akali actually had a bug that carried over from an Arena script change, which was in Arena, Akali's W is meant to restore 200 energy, not 100 energy, through what I assume is human error. This ended up affecting the Summoners Rift game mode as well. Obviously a mistake, so within about 24 hours, that was micro patched out or corrected or whatever, and Akali's energy restore on W was corrected. This ends up meaning that the 30 base health we gave Akali was under 1% of win rate, which is fine. That was kind of the expectation here. It wasn't meant to be a large buff, just one to maybe get some more excitement at MSI, and so it was a pretty small buff. Scarner The read I had from players was that Scarner top was clearly too good, and Scarner jungle was clearly ass. And we were seeing top lane pick rate go up, we were seeing jungle pick rate go down. Players were like, Scarner jungle sucks. And though I was pretty convinced that a recommended items, recommended runes update was going to have a meaningful amount of win rate impact, I thought that players would need to see buffs in order to believe that Scarner was going to be good. Even though I was pretty sure this champ was going to be OP, I thought it was wise to correct player perception. Now, what I thought we were giving Scarner was like, Scarner's going to be a little bit OP in the jungle, but like it's not going to be that bad. And, you know, by like the end of 14.8, it would be like, okay, players understand he's OP now and it's time to nerf him. He's like a little bit too strong. These changes ended up wildly overshooting, and so we slotted in micropatch Scarner nerfs within about 2 days. That took quite a lot of power down, around, I think, 1.5% win rate, if I recall correctly, about the impact of that. And then as of more, data from today, Scarner is clearly wildly overpowered in jungle. He's probably the single best jungler in the game, even with current player champion mastery, not to mention the fact that he's going to keep gaining win rate over the next 7 days here. So Scarner is clearly very OP in jungle. He is slightly OP in top lane, but not to a very, very large degree. Overall, Scarner is a harder to play jungler than he is top laner, so unsurprisingly, his like win rate by day is going up more in jungle than top lane because it's honestly just pretty easy to play top lane Scarner. Anyway, we micropatch nerfed him. We're then slotting more nerfs in this patch, and Scarner's just really OP. Graves, we did a micropatch, I guess, set of buffs too. I'll talk about it a little bit down the line. It's actually on the screen here. Last patch Graves, but essentially, we did a micropatch buff to Graves because part of what we did ended up being nerfed for the champion. We'll talk about it in a little bit. So yeah, OP, Scarner, very, very OP. We're nerfing him. Okay, fine. Gonna do that soon. Mordekaiser honestly seems fine. Unsurprisingly, his pick rate jumped up. His ban rate jumped up. His win rate basically didn't move. Data indicates that Mordekaiser is average to potentially slightly above average in difficulty for a champion. Like, not top tier difficulty, but like not the easiest. And so any time where you see a significant jump in play rate for a moderately hard champion, you'll often see some win rate decay. But even looking at like win rate by day as his play rate sort of decays, or the ones who are playing him are getting more mastery, we're not seeing really substantial play rate, or sorry, win rate by day increases on Mordekaiser. So really it turns out that like buffing the Q cooldown a little bit, levels 1 through 4, more or less compensated the E base damage nerf, and the R being uncleansable doesn't really have a big win rate impact. If you look at Mordekaiser versus Gangplank, I think that matchup moves around 1.5% win rate, but Gangplank is like 6% or 4% or something of Mordekaiser's games, so like, what's 6% of 1.5% win rate? Almost zero. The Olaf matchup went up by like 1% because Olaf still wins that matchup. And so, you know, what's 7% of 1% win rate? Almost zero. And so even though two of his matchup tables moved somewhat meaningfully, that doesn't matter in actual practice, and QSS turns out was just not on a lot of his targets anyway, and so Mordekaiser's actual win rate impact is pretty negligible here. That's fine. He's appropriately powerful, probably still. The important thing is, does Mordekaiser now feel like a much better champion? And my theory is yes, that Mordekaiser players are much happier. His ban rate is up. That doesn't surprise me in any way. That was an expected result here, but the ban rate is not climbing. It jumped up, and then it's like slowly decaying by day, which means I'm pretty confident this has been a good change, and I'm now more confident that we will do this kind of thing potentially to Scarner, Malzahar, Urgot, etc. Not next patch, not the patch after that probably, but at some point in the relatively near future, I'm pretty sure we can unbind QSS to these champions and let them be more reliable and make QSS just like a stronger item because they're going to be less effective otherwise. Again, not going to happen urgently, but I'm pretty confident this is the right thing for the champion, the right thing for the game, and so at some point, we'll probably do this on more than just Mordekaiser. Let's talk about Graves really quickly. So Graves had a quote-unquote bugged passive. So this is ultimately a little cursed. What it comes down to is Graves's reload speed is handled in his scripting. And the way it's handled is it says, okay, what is your total attack speed? Sorry, your total sources of bonus attack speed. I want you to subtract 3% from whatever level champion you are. That is not how attack speed actually works in League of Legends. It might have back when Graves was released, but it's no longer true. Also, Graves' attack speed isn't 3% per level until we micropatched it to 3%, 5 days ago or whatever. Which means, and then what it does is, now that it subtracts it, your number is now less than 1. Right? Because you're subtracting a number that is bigger than this actual amount of bonus attack speed, unless you're running stat shards and whatnot, which you often can, but you don't have to, right? It was meant that the equation was giving him a negative amount of attack speed, and then doing math on that to then calculate the reload speed. Yeah, not great. Anyway, when we said, okay, well, we should multiply this output by 1.35, we took a negative number, multiplied that by 1.35, and thus made his reload speed actually slower by multiplying the output of the attack speed formula. Oops, obviously a mistake there. Anyway, at some point we should rescript the passive to not be silly like that. That's not happening right away. It's not that hard to do, it's just a matter of priorities. Because this champion is functioning, it's okay. We're not really anywhere close to him building attack speed anyway, so it's not like this is like urgently holding down his like important builds or whatever. It just happens to be true. Anyway, that's why the changes that went into last patch were actually a nerf, because we were multiplying a negative, which is obviously making the champion weaker. So we reverted that line in a micro patch and instead just gave him some attack speed growth, which is going to do fairly similar things to champ overall. He still observes a lower win rate than before. A lot of this is Graves is one of the relatively harder to play junglers. He had a pretty big spike in play rate, and the buff just isn't that big. Also, players moving over to building crit Graves is just kind of still a bit weaker than lethality Graves. We can obviously shore this up by doing more updates to reload speed and making crit slightly better or something. And like, there's a bunch of stuff we can do to like make crit Graves better and try to enforce this as his primary playstyle, or at least a competitive playstyle, to be like equally powerful to lethality Graves. And play up his auto attacks versus spell damage. Like, these are things that we can do if we can spend the time to like do a patch's worth of work on Graves and like really move his numbers around. This is not urgent, but anyway, there's a story on Graves from last patch. Azir is sort of kind of in pro jail. I want to be clear, he's not really in pro jail. Azir is a very hard to play champion. He's top 5 in the game, which means generally speaking, this champion is meant to probably have one of the lowest 5 win rates in League of Legends. If we're going to directly compare champion mastery to performance and acknowledge that every champ is going to lose some win rate from rookies, Azir should be top 5 in win rate lost. Unless exclusively one tricks play Azir, which isn't true, he would have to be bottom 5 win rates if we were just to balance the game fairly across required champion mastery. So Azir is clearly bottom 5 win rates. Now, I think he's bottom 1. He's like tied with Casten, basically. Which, to be fair, those are probably... I don't know where Casten is. I think he's top 10. Regardless, like, that's relatively accurate, assuming we're going to balance the game around actual champion mastery. Through this lens, by the way, Rek'Sai is criminally overpowered, and no one seems to care, so it's not urgent that we're nerfing her. Of course, Azir was causing quite a bit of pro play staleness, so we're willing to nerf Azir. Again, he's not really pro jailed, because it's not like Sejuani, who's like quite easy, has a really garbage win rate and is getting played all the time. Azir is just like actually supposed to have a low win rate, maybe not quite this low, but like he's not far off from like the correct win rate for Azir. He's like maybe minus 1%, but like Varus is more pro jailed than Azir at current tuning, to be clear, right? Like Azir is actually not the most pro jailed champion, but hey, by the way, this is acknowledgement of something that is true. This is acknowledgement of something that really kind of sucks. I don't like when this has to happen. This only happens a couple of times a year. We can probably do a little bit of unwinding, like killing tank Azir will help because it'll make him less flexible. And so we can go in and take a patch and, you know, cut some of the base damage off of W, like from the level up, and give it back as AP ratio. And we can figure out if like E or something is cast more in pro play versus solo queue and make costs or cooldowns where it's like, there's things we can do for sure. We can slow his dash speeds, which I'm pretty sure is like, does something at least. But anyway, at some point in time, we can certainly do a little bit of unpro binding to Azir. Regardless, Azir's win rate is not extremely far below what is probably correct for him. It's a little bit below what's correct for him, but like not to a huge degree. Zack's nerfs ended up being about 1% win rate, roughly. Weirdly to me, but this seems to be true from now a lot of data, this change ended up being pretty equal in terms of top lane versus jungle impact, which surprised me because I would have thought that like dedicated regen and not getting every blob would have mattered more in top lane. That said, though, this still had a meaningful and measurable power level impact. And the nice thing there is we are seeing Zack's ban rate decay. His win rates are totally reasonable. They're like 50 point X, which is fine in almost every skill level, or at least, sorry, in almost every role here, generically, just average across player base. And with his ban rate decaying, it's fine. He like is kind of strong, but as long as his laning phase feels assailable, which I think it kind of is now, player base seems to be okay on this, and so we might not need to do any further actions on Zack. We'll see long term, but this seems to be kind of reasonable, and so no urgent action required here. And then everyone else pretty much pretty good. honestly, the changes all seem mostly fine. Win rates seem okay. Players and ban rates seem okay. So overall, pretty good patch. There's a couple things that we missed on. Scarner, I would argue we actually missed on. Zach, I am surprised we didn't get more top lane movement than jungle movement. But otherwise, I mean, pretty much everything worked the way it was supposed to. Again, Graves bugs, kind of weird. All right, so let's talk about what's going into the patch itself. First thing, there is a set of big changes to fighter items. So these 5 fighter items are getting modified here. The headliner is a pretty significant reshape to Ma that I am expecting to be a buff. I'm hoping it's a buff, and I'm really hoping that players will perceive it to be a buff. Ma is gaining 15 haste and 5 AD at cost of 10 MR and 300 gold. Statistically, like just base stat profile, gold efficiency, whatever, this is a buff to the item. This item is stronger as an item. Additionally, there is a buff to the unique passive. Both the shield duration is going up half a second, and the Omnivamp is going, or sorry, the 12% lifesteal is becoming 10% Omnivamp. That is a very, very, very large buff to the unique passive. 10% Omnivamp is what Riftmaker gives you after 5 seconds. This basically ties Riftmaker, what the Riftmaker output is, which seems reasonable. In every single possible realistic context, 10% Omnivamp is far, far better than 12% lifesteal. And the entire time, the target champion in my mind is Riven. It's, hey, I think we've done a good job recently of giving mid to heavy fighters a good suite of items that they will enjoy, and that is great. That we have a lot of tools that are good for, you know, Red Kayn, Xin Zhao, Vi, sized champions, the old Gore Drinker cast, like, this is sort of the group of champions who are meant to get a good amount of durability from their slots, and Sterix is good, and Sundered Sky is good, and these things have good amount of health on them, and these items are good. And it's like, yeah, I think we've done a pretty good job of getting those in a good spot. The champions I think we have slightly underserved are very, very light fighters, the ones that almost border on being assassins, but don't necessarily buy lethality. This is Riven, this can be Fiora, this in some cases can be Camille, but like that to me is sort of like the poster children of what this item is meant to be for. So a couple things I want to point out is, number one, haste is considered a core stat for fighters. In the way that we give attack speed or haste out like candy, repeatability is a core tenet of being a fighter. If you do not use haste, you become closer and closer and closer to being an assassin, because then you just one-shot people. And if your outputs are only damage, you become closer and closer to being a juggernaut, where your repeatability is just, well, I can't die. Like, look at the average Dr. Mundo build, where haste doesn't matter, attack speed doesn't matter, it's just be as big as possible, because I will eventually just hit you 17 times. I will eventually throw 15 Qs out. You think about what Riven's doing, and it's, no, I want to be highly repeatable. Yes, she can do a one-shot combo and you know, kill you from full with flash. If you're Twitch and she's level 15 Riven, that's still going to be possible. But if that's less of the power budget and it's more, no, my repeatability is good, that's what we want for a lot of these light fighters, where it's not just in burst damage, right? You might have as much AD as an assassin, but you won't have as much lethality as an assassin. So they have this multiplier from lethality from increasing just burst damage. You have a damage modifier in haste, which is increasing utility, which is increasing repeatability, which is increasing uptime, because fighters are about sustained combat in the way that marksmen are about sustained combat, and that they get a ton of attack speed. The point is to say, yes, we are embracing that haste is clearly a core stat for fighters. I want to be really clear about that one, that like we intentionally give more haste to fighters than any other class in the game. If fighters don't have the most haste, broad strokes, it is totally reasonable to have a fighter build with very, very low haste on it, right? If you're doing Titanic Hydra and Sterix Gauge and you're doing more Juggernaut type stuff, that is totally fine. You don't have to have high haste, but having high haste access as a fighter is working as intended. So this is meant to be a buff to Ma. It might be kind of the headlining change of the item changes here. There's a much more simple buff to Deathdance, plus 5 AD, plus 50% or 0.25 AD ratio to the healing on the passive. There is a limit to how strong Deathdance can be. When you come out with a bunch of Omnivamp, or you come out with a bunch of healing off of champion kill, this can turn fighters, like there's a little bit of a nice edge thing here for fighters, where if they are tanky enough and deal enough damage, and they feedback loop damage into healing, they can get to the point where they are snowballing and kind of 1v9 in game by themselves. But because these champions are melee and often a little bit squishy, because their items skew squishy relative to like Juggernaut style items, that there's always the core weakness of, yeah, but you got to be Riven around 5 champions. Good luck being Riven with a Malzahar ultimate in the game. Good luck being Riven when you get Varus ulted. Good luck being Riven when Nautilus presses R on you. That's really hard. It's a lot easier to be Dr. Mundo in that case. And so in a lot of these cases, light fighters will be very, very good in 1v2s, 2v2s, 2v3s, and a little bit worse in 5v5s, 5v4s, 3v5s, right? And that is intended. That is like going to be a core strength and weakness of that subclass of champions, where you can't really withstand a 5-on-5 very well, and you've got to figure that out. That's just going to be how the game works. Turns out AD carries really suck in 2-on-2s, so, figure out a way to play around that. Jinx is really weak to Rengar. Okay. I think that's actually not true because you can Flame Chomper him, but, like, conceptually, AD carries are weak to Rengar, and conceptually, Riven is weak to 5-on-5s, and that balance is important, and having the tactical and strategic differences across his champions is important and valuable and good, and this is going to exist and be true. So, anyway, playing up Deathdance as more of a light fighter item, it's still got the damage decay going in. It's got the reset on kill going in. It's more AD to be a more damage item thing. One thing I just want to bring up here with Ma is specifically bringing down the MR while bringing up the shield value. One thing that I actually consider pretty important here, because it's also a nerf to Hex Drinker, it's losing 5 MR here as well, is Ma, when it has too much MR, not only shuts down the one-on-one case where you're no longer interactable, but it also shuts down the burst case. In general, I believe the correct version of Ma, and to a certain degree Hex Drinker, is this item is meant to be good against the burst case. This can tank a, single Veigar R. This can tank a Syndra ulti. This can tank one big ticket spell, but the MR is not so high that I'm just immune to a magic damage dealer for the rest of the game. This is why Hex Drinker is being basically strictly nerfed, is that as a one-item rush, it's not meant to shut you down in lane. It's why Ma is being moved a little bit away from MR, just generically good against magic damage, to, hey, here's a shield, this is going to keep me from getting one shot, so that I have some time to maybe get out my entire spell rotation and maybe win the one-on-one, but not meant to remove all interaction, right? MR makes it worse with Omnivamp, the shield makes it, I don't get one shot. And then the other kind of point here is, that's actually pretty much it. It's just to try to move around. Oh, the other point, sorry, is that every champion has more armor than Magic Resist. And so in terms of the individual impact of each stat, 1 point of armor means less compared to like getting health or getting lifesteal or getting attack damage than 1 point of Magic Resist by comparison, right? Like the value of armor versus the value of MR. MR is just better, assuming you're only seeing one damage type come in. And so I'm generally a fan of trying to have there be a little bit less MR per slot than armor per slot if the items are meant to be comparable, because the actual impact of the MR is strictly higher because that's just how the stats work out. Anyway, one other thing to bring out here is that point of this, part of this is trying to close the gap between among Ma, Deathdance, and Sterix, where Sterix is far better than Ma or Deathdance, and so it's bringing these two up and bringing Sterix down, and so Sterix getting nerfed by 200 gold, as well as 30 seconds on the cooldown. This brings the lifeline cooldown to a consistent 90 seconds across, I believe, now all these items. It might be that like Nullifying Orb is still at 60 or something, but this brings more of the lifeline effects to the same cooldown, which I believe is good and correct for the game, so hooray. More understandable. I'm generally not a fan of having really, really short item active cooldowns. I think it's important that there is room for these actives to have room in between them, where there's not up all the time. That is a core part of your combat pattern, but it's a window where it matters, where it doesn't matter. So Strike Gauge is a slight move towards that direction. There's a lot of other items that have cooldowns that are probably not optimal for the design of the game. Summoner Sky getting nerfed. It is basically the most picked fighter item right now in League of Legends. Just a little bit too omnipresent, which means a little bit too strong. It's fine, that's fairly generic, but there are other generic fighter items that are meant to compete in this slot pretty well. Some of that is the defensive items like Ma, Deathdance, Sterix. Some of that is items like Black Cleaver. Overall, Summoner Sky is getting a small cooldown nerf, which will matter for its repeatability in champion combat, and a light tap to the upfront heal that's based on the base AD ratio, but not the missing health heal for your ability to sort of late combat, like heal yourself back up. Just a little bit of sort of less upfront power. Eclipse, a light nerf here as well. Eclipse basically is tied to Summoner Sky as the most picked fighter item in the game. Wanted to just open up a little bit more choice structure here in terms of what you're allowed to buy. Keep in mind, again, light fighter items in Ma and Deathdance are getting strictly more powerful. Though Eclipse is getting a little bit less powerful. Of course, we're only nerfing the melee damage proc here. Keep in mind, Eclipse is the cheapest fighter item in the game. It is a really, really strong power spike, and so we're kind of taking down some of the early power spike nature of the item while still keeping it as a different breakpoint timing. We think there's some value in having different item breakpoints. It creates some interest of like, oh wow, this lane goes equal. If we match recalls, I've got my first legendary, you don't. I've got a window here, and allowing you to have that sort of sort of like power profile difference, I think creates some interest. It can obviously go too far, and if Eclipse is OP and the cheapest, then it like really can break down some stuff. But if Eclipse is like balanced and cheaper, then cool. Next sort of big set of changes is we're doing a bunch to normalize some various internal radii of champions. So the one that's affecting the most champions is the click radius. This is how easy it is. This is not the range of targeted auto attacks or targeted spells, but the ease at clicking a champion for targeted auto attacks and targeted spells. So the ability to not miss the Garen when you're trying to mouse ult him, and then you still have to walk into the exact same range as before. And so this is largely a bunch of champions becoming easier to click, and a few champions becoming a little bit harder to click because their radius was just simply too large. This is not ultra normalizing every champion, but taking the outliers and moving them to somewhere more normal. It's also taking a small set of champions whose radii were sort of incorrect for their like visual model size in game and normalizing them. What's on PvE right now is not the perfect exhaustive list. I've got a couple more that I've got to put in the morning tomorrow before we cut the branch for the patch. But generally speaking, trying to say that if you look small, you are supposed to be actually small for things like hitboxes and auto attack radius. For what it's worth, this will have an impact in your outgoing auto attack radius as well. One of the champions we're making smaller is Darius. We'll see if people can actually feel a 15 auto attack range decrease. If so, we can always give him buffs or something down the line, or choose to actually increase his visual model size and put him back to like large champion model radius, gameplay radius. I'm not sure what's actually required here, but basically putting it in for consistency first. If there's an actual impact, we can then modify, further down the line as needed, but not expecting that to be really big. Now we go into individual champion changes, still with ones that I think are fairly big. A suite of changes to Akshan. So this is minus move speed when Q hits a champion at ranks 2 through 5, minus non-champion damage on Q at ranks 2 through 5, but then a very, very meaningful increase to R damage. It's around 30% increase at rank 1 of R to up to 50% increase at rank 5 of R if your target is full HP. Now, if they're missing health, this trends toward like 5% more damage. Also keep in mind that R applies Akshan passive, which accounts for about 15 to 20% of R's total damage, so the real throughput is not quite that high, but it's meant to be a really, really big swing in making Akshan R actually good, especially towards the early game. I'm a big fan of ultimates being high value and strong and reliable, so that even if you're having a pretty bad game, at least you can press R and to do something. I think ultimates are a really good place to put that because they are naturally windowed by things like cooldown and often target access. We tend to make relatively fair ultimates in terms of being telegraphed and windowed and whatnot. And not just fire and forget YOLO, it does whatever. So it's a nice way, I think, to put in damage, especially sort of late game, where this champion falls off a lot late game and also is very, very bad in lower MR. So having a more reliable, like, well, I'm bad at Akshan, or just like the game goes late and this champion requires you to end the game at 20 minutes. And so, well, here's some late game fallback pattern for the champion. While, rooming a little bit of roaming power, moving a little bit of kiting power, and that is disproportionately very, very high MR skewed. The goals here are to just nerf Akshan, especially in high MR. It would be really cool if he actually gained win rate in lower skilled play because he's actually pretty unperformant there. He's one of the harder to play champions. He's not meant to sit at 50% win rate in low MR by any means, but I think there's some tactical things we can do like this to close the gap and make for a slightly more fun champion that's a little bit more accessible, because I don't think being accessible is a bad thing. Bella's in a somewhat similar boat as well. Overall, her snowballing and PvP damage is on the very high side. She's one of the absolute top performers in high-level solo queue. She's maybe, outside of Scarner, the best high MR jungler. Maybe that's Talia. But regardless, like, Bella's really, really up there. And so we're taking down her ability to basically snowball a game and take over with aggressive PvP action and be like a really, really top tier invader, really, really top tier ganker, and top tier kind of snowball. And also, while we're there, though, once again, with the goals of somewhat reducing her MR skew, is make her a little bit easier to jungle on. So basically, this is just less damage in Q straight up. This is less attack speed for the majority of the game straight up, which will affect things like Q cooldown and like E damage a little bit here. Like, this has a little bit of knock-on effects here. It's not just I right-clicked you. This has effects kind of everywhere. Considering that she doesn't get attack speed growth, so it's all from the attack speed of her passive. This is the amount of attack speed coming out of her passive. The other change, though, is restructuring the Q damage to go away from just deal % more Q damage to monsters, and instead say deal a flat increase damage to monsters. I think in general, this is the better shape for monster damage ratios. This keeps champions from hyper one-shotting monster camps late game, and lets you instead just like, will give you enough damage to make your clear feel comfortable in, you know, first, second, third, fourth, fifth clear, but then it's not going to scale into the moon because they're not going to multiply a high gold scaling ability by 1.4 for the entire game when you clearly don't need it at level 15 with 4 items. And so I think this is structurally like right for the champion and right for League of Legends almost just overall. This is actually meant to be a bit of a low elo buff because her jungle is a little bit unsafe if you're not a good optimizer. Whereas obviously it's really trivial if you are an optimizer. This again will make her jungle clear still faster. Like she will have a literally just faster clear for optimizers as well, but it's meant to be especially easier for non-optimizers and make her a little bit easier to play, at least in the jungle. Kennen, I'm actually really excited about a change here. He's getting a, air quotes, new R. So this got spawned by wanting to make Kennen's ultimate not stop him in his tracks for a quarter second while casting the first part of the ability to like get the ability ready. And so I put in the gameplay changes. It's actually a relatively simple change to make that possible. But the problem was his animation did not line up with being able to move while casting it. It was like clearly unacceptable from an animation standpoint. And so for playtesting purposes, I replaced it with his W animation, which meant we were duplicating his W animation for both his W and his R, which is not great either. It's bad from a clarity perspective, and it's also just like not good from an overall like art quality perspective. So it's cool, and this would have come into 14.8 if we had had the bandwidth for it, but we didn't. So it's in 14.9. We got some time from an animator to make a new animation for Kennen R. Kennen R has not had a new ulti animation since he came out in like 2010 or 2011. So for the first time in like 13 years, Kennen has a new animation, which I think is really, really cool that like an old champion got a brand new animation. And it's not like the sickest stuff ever. That's not meant to be the goal. It's meant to be like utilitarian and serve the gameplay purposes. But hey, sweet, Kennen has a new animation. And to be fair, the old animation was pretty bad. This animation is like totally passable and reasonable. Again, it's not the sickest animation ever. That's not the goal. But it's cool that like, you know, it's just kind of sweet that we got a new animation for an old champion, and it suits the gameplay, and we think it's going to be making it much more fun. We think it's going to be a fair bit of power. This also means that there's now a positive synergy between Kennen E and Kennen R. Instead of I started E, then I pressed R, and now I'm wasting E duration because I'm stuck in place while casting this thing. So it's going to make him much more reliable at reaching backline and playing for his ultimate. That's power, right? This is meaningful power, but cool stuff for Kennen, I think. Nila is a nerf and a reshape. Nila is extremely overpowered. We've dragged her heels for a bit because we know she's quite unpopular, but there comes a time where it's like clearly correct of the champion, and we think the time is now. So this is meant to be very clearly power negative to Nila. She's meant to lose win rate. She can lose a lot of win rate here. However, one of the other goals is to move her low MR skew down a little bit and try to flatten the low MR skew a little bit against Elite. Those should probably still be low MR skewed. The other goal is meant to move her away from being very, very high burst and more towards sustained damage. So we're going to start with a buff here, which is reverting the Q passive attack speed nerf that was shipped around 8 patches ago or something. I forget exactly when, but a little while ago, we nerfed Nila's attack speed on Q, and this ended up being an Elite skewed nerf. And so we're going back on it because that's obviously anti to the goals. And also we want her to be a more sustained damage champion, less of a burst champion. And so we went for something that we could lower burst on as much as possible, which was on Q active damage. We went after the ult a little while ago, we thought that was fine. But now going after her Q active damage, and just kind of as a power reshape, that relative to her power budget, a balanced to slightly strong Nila should be more about sustained damage and less about really, really beefy, chunky Q hits. Obviously, if we heavily overshoot, we can walk back to the nerf. That's not a problem, or buffer in other ways. That's not a problem. But generally speaking, trying to make sure that trying to push Nila toward a sustained damage dealer. Sejuani is hopefully getting out of pro jail. We're buffing her in multiple ways, somewhat similar to the power curve of Scarner right now, which is playing up Sejuani's gold income. We know that we're not going to see pro plans patch for a while, and so, hey, Sejuani's pretty bad. Let's go ahead and buff Sejuani. Well, Sejuani right now is actually one of the lowest damage junglers in the game. That's a good thing. I'm not trying to make her a top level damage champion, but it does mean we have some room to go up. because we know that solo queue is always going to trend toward being somewhat selfish. And also, my very strong theory is that gold scaling is a very, very solo queue skewed lever compared to pro play skew. And so we have a lot of room for strict buffs to Sejuani. This is not meant to necessarily unpro skew her. This is just like strictly power positive for a champion who is already a pro play mainstay. So I would expect that if it had gone live last patch, Sejuani would be like just the #1 jungler in pros just straight up automatically. But again, the goal here is just like, here, have some power, we'll worry about what pro play thinks later with a different metagame in Summer Split, whatever, right? That's going to be a problem for future live design, not a problem here. So it is a bonus armor MR ratio increase of 50% on the passive, so going from 10 plus 60% bonus to 10 plus 75% bonus. This ends up only really being about a like 7 to 8% durability increase in the mid game during your passive, and then that will fall off. But for the first, 3 seconds, you're going to be about 8% more durable. And if you go really, really late game, it's even more than that. Like, the more items you have, the more this matters. Obviously, if you're like first recall Bombi Cinder, you have literally 0 bonus armor MR unless Aftershock triggers, in which case, yeah, it's up a little bit higher for a little bit. But basically, it's after your third or so recall, once you start getting some armor and MR, this is a much stronger ability. And then the W is being reshaped to have less base damage and more of a max health ratio. The math works out that if you buy literally 0 bonus health ever, it's technically a nerf. That's obviously very, very fraudulent. Overgrowth is basically mandatory. Double scaling health stat shards is automatic. Her builds are pretty high HP. Bombi Cinder is pretty common, but the more health you buy on this champion, the better it's going to be. And so it's a health ratio increase of 50%. It's also a reshape of the damage such that the W1 damage is going up by more than the W2 damage. Really just to say that W2 carries twice as much damage as W1. This doesn't have to be the right answer here, but it's what I chose to be like the numbers because, I don't know, it made sense that I tried to be a little more consistent and say that W2 is twice as good as W1. But the total damage of W itself is being, moved in that regard. Do I think W1 versus W2 is skewed one or the other? Not really. This was like, well, I'm already doing the numbers, so I'm going to pick numbers that I like and appeal to me because I think they're neat. And so this is what I did. Maybe the damage on W1 versus W2 is meant to be skewed one or the other. We can figure that out over time. That's fine, right? That's totally reasonable to figure out where the damage numbers are actually really supposed to be. But ultimately, this is just what's happened: is W1 got more of the buff than W2 got. Whatever. Scarner is super OP in the jungle. He is a little bit OP in top lane, but not by a meaningful degree. There's actually one change not mentioned here, which is his mana regen growth is going up a little bit. Generally speaking, top lane is going to be mana hungrier than jungle. Additionally, Scarner is currently extremely high MMR skewed. Some of this we expected coming in. This was like an explicit shot call we had coming in that the kit we made for Scarner is going to be innately elite skew because it's going to be very hard to play and hard to optimize. And so we indeed see a pretty severe elite skew, a little bit sharper than we really want, but we expected it to be here and it is indeed here. That's fine. That's not a problem. It's just a truth. That said, Scarner's power curve is a little bit early game skewed, which means we can undo that a little bit and flatten him out a little bit. And that's just an easy way to undo some elite skew. So, hey, here's some stat growth. Stat growth will just be a little bit low MR skewed because low MR games go later. Okay, great, fine. Anyway, we are going back on the Q damage increase that was shipped back a patch ago. The damage increase on rank up was done as a way to try to make good against the W rank up, and we needed to give this champion power somewhere, and so we chose Q rank up. We're going back to 10 to 50 by rank instead of 10 to 70 by rank, ultimately trying to go a bit lower on the level 9 power spike of very, very high damage from Scarner. Okay, fine. There was an optimization with Q where if you auto attack a ward or a plant, it would not consume a Q stack, but would refresh the duration. Now, things that do not consume a stack do not refresh the duration. So traps, wards, and plants do not consume stacks of Q. They will also no longer refresh the duration of Q. So the optimization of press Q early on your first buff, then hit the blast plant to jump over the wall, then start your Q with like 9 seconds added to your Q timer, giving you a really good first click optimization. That's going away, which is going to be elite skewed, is going to be early game skewed. And again, this is just like, hey, optimizations are fine. There's not a problem with doing them, but this is a pure upside optimization of it doesn't consume the stack, but it refunds. No, this is basically a not fair sort of thing. It's really mild, don't get me wrong, but this rubs me the wrong way, and so it's going away because this is not what's needed for him. Knowing that we are nerfing a Q rank up, we are nerfing some parts of W rank up because there's only so low we can go on some of the Q points, so we're going to take damage from elsewhere as well. And E as a chunky, like, wall hit explosion bit of damage we think is still pretty appropriate in terms of actual impact right now. Anyway, we are removing the slow increase on rank up on W. So W will now have a flat 30% slow instead of 20 to 40 by rank. We are also nerfing the W shield from 9% max health to 8% max health. This is probably going to be the single biggest win rate impacting change here. But basically what it is right now is that Scarner is just below the 50th percentile for damage dealt by a jungler. That's higher than I think is reasonable for him, and so having a damage decrease somewhere is good. Scarner is not meant to be sort of on the high end or even really the medium end for damage. The hope is that Scarner can be, a bottom third damage dealing jungler, and that will be sort of more reasonable for him. So again, a very strict damage decrease on Q is very much essential here, right? If we were out of space on Q, we'd look for E or pass or something else, but this is a pretty free hit right now, and then we'll, look down the line if we have to do more. But additionally, Scarner is pretty much like bottom champions in jungle period for deaths per game. Scarner does not die. And we knew some of this was going to be true with his E. E's ramping up, like the ramping up move speed on E was there because we knew his in-combat evasion was really high. This was before I even took over the project, but like, the fact that it was meant to be a really slow ramp up, the fact that you couldn't like trigger phase rush and then E out at Mach 4, like all these things were all very intentional to say no. It's really meant that like Thresh can react to the starting and go for a Flay, or Amelia can react and go for a Q, and you can knock Skarner out of E because we knew it was a really, 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 really good evasion tool. It's part of why we have a bunch of incentives for landing E in a fight, so that is hopefully not up because using it to kill people. Anyway. We know E is that good. There's not a lot of levers left for making that weaker. So we're going after one of the other durability outputs, which is the shield. Skarner's base stats are already pretty normal. I don't personally like going for low-end base stats if I can help it. I like when champs have a reasonable level of reliability. So we're going after shield, which is going to be a bit more flat. It's just the shield is strictly 12% weaker at all points in time. The gold scaling is down, the flat level scaling is down, the early game stuff is down. It's a weaker ability. It's going to block 12% less damage if it wasn't going to time out already. Skarner is going to be, more fragile, more easily killed. Okay, great. And we think low cooldown shield is good in terms of having a gameplay pattern that has some interaction, which has buttons that Skarner actually wants to press. We're just kind of lowering the impact of these repeatable W buttons. All right. Those are all like the big headline changes. We're going to go through a bunch of smaller stuff now that's going to be a little bit easier to talk about. Ari is just simply overpowered. 5 damage off W. Ulti cooldown being nerfed at ranks 2 and 3. I want to say here, this champ is on the strong side and should be nerfed. Amumu is far too weak for what he's supposed to be in, especially in like lower skill brackets. Amumu is very, very, very easy to play. I think he's top 10 easy to play champions in League of Legends. He's very, very straightforward. So his win rate is not extremely high and low. Omar, this champion, is just simply weak. While we're here, again, I love bringing up base stats of champs who have bad base stats. And I also like fixing Omar skew where it is free and easy and convenient. That's why I like giving Amumu easier and safer and faster early jungle clears, because if you're a brand new League of Legends player and it's like, baby's first jungler, here's Amumu, and it's like, oh, your first clear is healthy, it's easy, it's straightforward, the buttons all work, it's relatively fast without optimization, like, just go for it, have fun. We know fast and safe early jungle clears are elite skewed, but also they're really, really good for brand new players. And so as far as I'm concerned, anytime that I can kind of kill towards one stone and it's just correct for the champion outright, awesome. And so it's level 1 base stats on if you're, bad at optimizing your E resets and kiting with W and all these things that elite players can do. It's just 4 damage per auto. I right-clicked on the Raptor, I press W, my timing on E is bad. All right, well, the worse your optimization is, the better 4 AD does for you. Congratulations. It's pretty free. 3 armor, are you bad at your clear for some reason? Cool, you're going to take less damage in the jungle. It's going to be fine. The worse your clear is, the more armor matters, it's going to mitigate damage taken as you clear too slowly. Great. This also has, I would, in some cases, because it's an early game buff, somewhat of an elite skew to it, potentially. But I think it's a really good change for Amumu because his base stats actually are quite low. He has very low base AD for a tank. He has very low base armor for a tank. Now, the E passive gives him immediate passive durability, which makes his base stats kind of lie in the way that, like, Sejuani passive can get knocked off and then she just has normal champion stats. Amumu E is just always on and just makes him always take less damage. So there's some of, like, the base stats argument that is a bit of a lie here, but regardless, I think he can go up. Aurelion Sol is on the strong side. I do not think this champion is like earth-shatteringly too strong. His high-ish MMR win rate is like a little bit above 50. He's like 51% in Emerald Plus. Like, yeah, he's like kind of on the strong side, but also whatever. 51 is not an earth-shattering win rate by any means. That said, Aurelion Sol is pretty low MMR skewed. And of course, his late game is extremely good. So there's two things here. I'm a fan of doing an E-ratio nerf because this is a fairly low interest skill in terms of actual damage output. This is not the enjoyable part of Aurelion Sol's damage. This is a way to nerf late game, which him having high late game is going to be there for a long time. We can tap it down a little bit and we still have like miles of room to go. But it's really just like a very easy, like low interest spell. This also asks him to be more active in all of his gameplay because this brings less of his power budget into E. It also is going to make it a little bit harder to earn stacks, and so him going to infinity is going to be a little bit harder. I don't think it's a problem that the stacking is a little bit harder. Keep in mind that one of the primary things that we did a little while ago was make him care more about queuing champions for stats, which was like hugely positive for his like gameplay. Made him a much more fun champion, made him much more popular, made him much more balanceable overall. Great, right? All positive things here. And so like lowering some of the low interaction power is a good thing. One other point is that E, as a portion of his damage output, is pretty meaningfully low MMR skewed. And so nerfing a low MMR skewed ability allows him to not have to have extreme low MMR skew. And he can maybe just have like a fairly normal win rate in all places, which is probably just a good thing overall. Now, it might be that long term we actually really want Aurelion Sol to be extremely low MMR skewed. I don't think that's true, but I could, stand to be wrong here. Anyway, we'll have to find the changes here. Blitzcrank, there's two factors here for Blitzcrank. One is he is actually one of the easiest champs to play in League of Legends. There's not a lot of champ mastery to learn about Blitzcrank. The other, though, is Blitzcrank is the default go-to auto-filled support pick. It's just the one that your generic auto-filled support goes to. And so the being easy would inflate his win rate. The being the auto-fill pick would deflate his win rate. And I don't have a good way of quantifying which factor matters more. I just don't. My hypothesis is that it's written to actually deflate his win rate, and that Blitzcrank is a balanced champion at a somewhat low win rate. Slightly sub 50, honestly. Now, to be clear, I think Blitzcrank is meant to kill you off of one or two hooks. He is meant to be highly lethal. This is the entire purpose of the champion. He is a highly lethal champion. Champions who are lethal in laning phase are going to tank high ban rates. That is going to happen. That is going to be true. We're not going to shy away from that. It's just going to be a fact of life. That said, we can still balance this champion, acknowledging that he's going to be high ban rate no matter what we do. Okay, fine. So two things here. One is I think just incrementally making League a slightly better designed game, nerfing the passive duration shield from 10 seconds to 4 seconds. I think this should be one of the longer shields in the game because you do not have control over when it pops. But that said, a 10-second long shield makes you, pretends you can wait it out, but you absolutely can't. There is no reason to ever try to wait out Blitzcrank shield at 10 seconds. By putting it at 4 seconds, it is still one of the longer shields in the game. And you might potentially consider waiting out the shield in some contexts. You likely still won't. This will be very little power impact, but I think it's a good change overall for just yeah, this will matter once in a while, and it's just correct for League of Legends the game. Otherwise, it's taking some front-loaded move speed off of the decaying buff on Blitzcrank W. Neither of these are going to be really high win rate impact. This champion, again, I don't think is extremely overpowered by any means, but considering we are really not trying to go after his damage very much, it's just trying to find other things we can chip away at. One thing that's actually worth noting is that Blitzcrank actually has a fairly low deaths per game, especially for a relatively aggressive support. And so making Blitzcrank a bit more susceptible to being killed, which is, hey, here's a shield nerf, and hey, here's a little bit of escapability nerf, directionally kind of good for the champion. We can actually make Blitzcrank die a bit more often, and we think that'll actually help with some small amount of champion frustration by making him a little bit more killable. Evelynn is getting her second nerf here. I think Evelynn is still a little bit too on the strong side. One thing to point out is that she is one of the higher mastery curve champions in League of Legends, which means we should tend to see a lower win rate on this champion because more players are going to deflate her win rate. And so I think a relatively high Evelynn win rate makes me believe that she's an overpowered champion. And so I think she can go down. And so we slot her in for nerfs, and this got accepted. This is basically, if you were looking at changes from around 6 months ago or something, these were some of the nerfs that were on the old Evelynn nerfs back then. And these are meant to be somewhat elite skewed nerfs. One is the slow on W. This affects the uncooked slow. So if she doesn't wait around for the full charm, how easy it is for you to escape on the receiving end. Generally speaking, I think these levers tend to be a little bit high MMR skewed, so I expect this to nerf high armor a little bit more. And then the R ratio essentially brings down her ability to one-shot non-squishies. She's basically always going to overkill Jinx and Zeri and Aphelios and whatever. That's not really going to change, but it's going to make Evelynn less reliably able to kill everyone. There's an argument to be made that Evelynn should care, that, you know, she should be softened and not only just one-shot 80 carries. Everyone's going to have their own inflection point of where it's too much or too little for an assassin. I think she can become a little bit sharper and like less generically good at just kind of killing whatever she wants. That's my opinion. So it was the nerf I went for here, but it's not necessarily exactly the right change, just what I thought was correct. Janna is getting an adjustment / nerf here. The goal here is absolutely minus win rate on Janna. Right now, WMAX Janna is around 2.5% win rate higher than Emax Janna. And so they're trying to bring those builds closer together in power level. Generally speaking, defensive enchanters can really reliably sit at like 51.5 to 52% win rates, and no one bats an eye. Someone has to eat the win rate of, you know, like unskilled Nautilus players tanking the win rate and whatnot. Just like, you know, win rate is zero sum. At the end of the day, people don't seem to mind defensive enchanters on average, and so it's a reasonable place for win rate to exist. Another lens for this is if we want to encourage structured team fights, having slightly inflated win rates for top lane tanks and slightly inflated win rates for defensive enchanters will make the average game more likely to have reliable front lines and reliable back lines and structure the team fights and less one-shotting, which I believe makes League of Legends a better game. If your only lens is let's have game-to-game variety, encouraging enchanters and encouraging top lane tanks increases game-to-game variety. There are a lot of goods to, even if the game is technically slightly less balanced, the overall impact here is arguably a better game. Additionally, defensive enchanters tend to be fairly easy to play, so in terms of where the win is going to go, well, the easy champ's going to eat win rate compared to hard champions, right? All these things are relevant factors. So regardless, the nerfs to W are significantly larger than the nerfs to E. W is losing 0 to 20, E is gaining 0 to 20, but W is also losing a 10% AP ratio. Janna is a core Magi's purchaser, or at least Darksteel purchaser, and so her damage gets really, really high, really, really fast. The thing is, because she can invest in bonus boosting to gain more W damage, she has actually very, very high W baseline damage, as well as a functionally rather high W gold scaling damage. So she still has a lot of control over how she scales her W, but trying to bring the build close together in power level. Jinx is a pretty meaningful nerf to her R cooldown. This is minus 15, minus 10, or sorry, plus 15, plus 10, plus 5 on the R cooldown. Early Jinx RCD is simply way too short. This brings it up to 85 from 70, which puts it more to a reasonable marksman ulti cooldown, at least in the early game. This was getting spammed way too hard for just doing ulti resets. Jinx's pick rate right now is a little bit elite skewed. Her win rates are relatively flat, which is fine, but we're trying to go for a somewhat elite skewed nerf because that is where more of her pick rate and more of her ban rate is, which means that high MR players believe Jinx to be stronger than low MR players believe her to be, which means trying to go for higher MR nerfs, which is early game nerfs, which is ulti spam nerfs, which, yeah, all positive things here. That said, Jinx are still a relatively low cooldown. It's still a pretty effective tool. Okay, great. Karma is on the weak side here. Right now, mid lane Karma has a slightly higher win rate than support Karma. Both of these roles can sustain some win rate, though support Karma can sustain a lot more. If we simply give this champion more damage, she risks becoming primarily a mid laner again, which people didn't really enjoy. And honestly, the gameplay pattern of her damage is honestly pretty low variance. And you max it first, and there's not much else to do, and so she just kind of starts chunking you pretty early on the game. And just like, yeah, the interest in her PvP interactions are just like not that high overall. There can be more work done down the line, but again, this is just to say that we're going for utility skewed buffs to Karma, which will still strictly buff her in mid, but will also strictly buff her, we're hoping, by more in support, and hoping that Karma can sustain a like 48 to 49% win rate at support and be fair and fun and appreciable and all those things. So a moderate 5% increase to Q slow. This is not the RQ slow. The RQ slow is not being changed. And a meaningful increase to the AoE shielding of R plus E, not single target shielding, but the AoE shielding, as well as a small increase to the movement speed buff of the R plus E buff. Now that R plus E is decoupled from E's rank itself, We've got a lot of tools to play with now. It's a lot easier to reach this champion. And so playing up specifically her utility outputs if she wants to play a bit more utility. Now, Karma is still a quite high damage support. She is clearly higher damage per game than Sona and Nami and especially Lulu. The only supports who are like Enchanter-y who deal more damage than her are like Morgana and Lux. And Lux is, let's be clear, basically a burst mage. But like right now, Karma's damage per game is, I believe, tied with Seraphine if I remember correctly. So like Karma is a relatively high damage support. Like, let's be clear, this is actually true. She has a relatively high damage support. She has a completely viable Malignance into Imperial Mandate build. If you want to play her Enchanter, you can, but I expect most players will build her as an AP support. That is a viable build. That is fine. But we are buffing the ability to play more for the Enchanter style, more for your whole team, which to me seems reasonable, which to me seems fine. And so that is a tool we're giving her to buff her more in support than in mid. We are nerfing Casten. We are nerfing the AP ratio on E. Basically, Casten is definitely too strong right now. I did some math on his win rate based on matchup tables, and he gains about 0.2% win rate based on his common and uncommon matchups. So, you know, if you want to argue like Casten is extremely strong because he's used the counter pick, or he should be weak because he's against Yasuo, it's like he's plus 0.2%. He's got a little bit of win inflation, which means if you only care about chance being 50, Cash should be 50.2. I don't think we should only care about chance being 50, but whatever, that point is there. Anyway, playing down the ranged outputs of Casten a little bit, such that if you want to kill champions, you more likely have to R on top of them and use that as your primary damage tool, or as a primary damage tool, so that you are in melee range and you have the opponent counterplay of your melee, we're going to deal with you, and not just R'ing to stay at distance and using QE spam to get kills. Malahar is getting some pretty meaningful buffs aimed at the early game. I'm trying, so there's two things I care about. One is basically give champions real mana costs again. I've been very happy to increase mana costs where relevant, but also to decrease them where relevant, and also, tweak mana pools and whatnot to give more champions real mana costs that matter, that should be played around. That said, I also really want to give more abilities, scaling mana cost with rank, because that is a good way to say, hey, I've finished Max's ability, so my ability is now 3 to 4 times more powerful than it was before. So the cost should probably go up because the amount of output per button I'm getting is going up. So my cost per button should probably go up as well. If you don't do this, you can get in states where either one, this spell costs nothing, and sometimes they're meant to cost nothing. That's okay. It's reasonable to have spells cost functionally nothing. That is a thing you can say, and it is defensible to do so. But if we were going to say that, hey, champs have real costs, and your cost doesn't go up with rank, this means that you get to a point where, oh, rank 1's ability is now a liability. I'm hurting myself by casting a spell. And so in a world where mana costs are real and your costs don't scale with rank, you can have trap costs. And so this is what's going on with Malahar here, is basically making Q cheaper ranks 1, 2, 3, and 4. Because this thing costs 80 mana right now, and 80 mana is a lot of mana to spend for a short cooldown rank 1 spell. This is a huge mana per second. And I'm like, this is kind of not reasonable. Let's make this a little bit nicer. And so 60 to 80 might not be the exact correct mana cost long-term period forever, but considering Malahar has a big mana refund on his E, caring about his late game mana cost is not the most important thing ever, but his late game mana costs do kind of suck. Worth noting that Malahar is very low MMR skewed, and the early game buff tends to be high MMR skewed, and so buffing him in high MMR is, as far as I'm concerned, free real estate, and just kind of worth doing. And this is an experientially good thing for Malahar players. It hits skew goals. It's just a free change. I don't know why we'd ever revert this. Next thing is an E cooldown buff, ranks 1 through 4. It's still hard to get multiple E's off in a meaningful cadence here, but again, it's the fact the champion has a 15-second window, or really 12 because of the buff duration, between dealing damage on E is a very, very, very long time of doing nothing on Malahar, which I don't think is quite correct here. And so a pretty heavy buff to rank 1 E cooldown, which still matters even at rank 4, is a meaningful buff to his early game. This is going to help him get more last hits, help him get more wave pressure, help him have more reliable trading patterns, because it's more likely he's going to have E back to trade back with you when you go for him and whatnot. It's just a lot of power in the early game. Cheaper Qs, which means more Qs, more E's straight up. more ability to get mana cost refunds by, putting the bounce through the wave, all these things. Just like this can snowball into a very meaningful laning phase buff for Malzahar and meant to be a pretty meaningful amount of high elo win rate. Master Yi is actually, contrary to popular opinion, one of the harder to play champs in League of Legends. Master Yi is easily top half mastery curves in League of Legends. Master Yi is actually not easy. I know his perception is Pub Stomper, and to be clear, way back when, in like 2012, that was probably true. That is no longer true. Master Yi has a lot of very tight timing tests. He now has a very reliable untargetability with a reset on his Q, which means there is a lot of skill testing to can you Q at the right time and dodge spells. Way back when, I don't remember what Cowsep called it, but like way back when, like Master Yi Q was really unreliable and a lot of stuff would hit him anyway. And so it meant that if you were good at Master Yi Q, it didn't matter because you would get hit by random stuff no matter what. It's much more reliable now, which means there was a very strong skill test in using Q appropriately. Master Yi W has a significant amount of damage reduction at the very beginning of the channel, which means you can use W as a timing test to parry a significant amount of damage, which makes him an actually fairly high skill cap skirmisher. He's actually a fairly high skill cap skirmisher. Which means that actually Master Yi is kind of hard to play. There's a lot of optimization here. He has a very high mastery curve, or at least, again, above average mastery curve, which means that Master Yi shouldn't actually be like 53% low elo win rate because he's easy like Misfortune and Moo. He's nowhere close to Misfortune and Moo, Ashe, whatever's like mastery curves. It's not close at all. It's steeper than like Ahri, for example. Anyway. So this means that, no, this champion at his current tuning should not be this. Now, if we make the call that Master Yi should actually be easier and we should remove some skill tests and we should, I don't know, make Q reset less aggressively so you have fewer resets, I'm not saying that's correct for the champion. If we want to remove the instant DR on W and make it less good as a like timing parry, we could do that, make him easier to play, and then just give him simple power to make him easy and very good in Silver League of Legends solo queue. We could do that and say the way you beat Master Yi is get good and learn coordination, and once you do that, you'll be fine. But that is not true right now with League of Legends, and that's not true right now with Master Yi. So this champion does not have a mastery justification for a high win rate. Anyway, all that said, for Master Yi having a late game carry skill fantasy and sort of performance fantasy, his early game output is simply too high. He is actually really good at early dueling, and so in a way to nerf him disproportionately in high MMR, in a way to disproportionately nerf him in ways that are not the kinds of things that Master Yi players really want, we are tapping down some damage on the E, specifically in the early game. Now, this is going to matter at all points in time. It's flat 10 damage off the E, but it matters more in the early game compared to, rank 5 and when you get bonus AD and stuff later on in the game. Next up is a set of Olaf changes. Olaf top lane is very OP. When we were adding Olaf jungle back into the game, we tried pretty hard to compensate his top lane power level. That's true. Our last several Olaf jungle patches treaded water in Olaf top lane win rate. Cool, great, that's a good thing. But now we want to take Olaf top down in power. So we're doing some strict nerfs to Olaf. One, we are taking 5 damage off Olaf Q, just basically taking down some early game dueling from Olaf. Early game dueling is high MR skewed, and so it's a high MR skewed nerf to Olaf, a champion who is high MR skewed as a champion. This existing at all is fine, but this is true. Next is a change that I did more for overall what I consider gameplay health. I basically think we should have a little bit more constraints over the amount of magic resist in the game. Broadly speaking, there are fewer ways to multiply magic damage than physical damage, which means if magic resist ever gets out of hand, you can become unkillable to magic damage. I'm overstating it, but taken to infinity, that can become more true than for physical damage, where there are just more multipliers, so it's never possible to become invincible to physical damage. Even though you have Randuin's Owen, which is just % less crit damage, and Frozen Heart, which is just % less attack speed, and Steel Caps, which is just % less auto attack damage, you still have more physical damage multipliers, auto attack damage multipliers, and they can still overtake tanks. This is still clearly true. Again, this is less true for magic damage, this is less true for AP. You can soften it in some cases with things like Nashor's Tooth and Azir specifically, but Azir is kind of the only exception, and for the most part, unless you're again going to infinite scale on Azir and whatnot, it's just not really true elsewhere. And so having some level of constraints and acknowledging that magic damage is a more closed system, both on outgoing damage and incoming damage reduction, I would like to kind of close some of the gaps there where it makes sense. Buying MR is totally fine. That's a completely reasonable thing to do. But for example, our base stats in League of Legends are actually pretty constrained in both armor and MR, but it's especially constrained in terms of MR. And so anywhere where champions just get natively really high MR kind of for free, completely passively, I want to long-term chip away at. Now, exceptions are totally fine for exceptions. Meganar has the highest base MR in the game. That's fine. Salas has really, really high MR growth as just a tuning lever to get him some low MR skew because this guy was so incredibly elite skewed in Pro Jail that just people threw everything they possibly could at, normalizing the skew, and one of them was a, ton of MR growth. Okay, that's fine for a tactical reason, but Olaf, though, to be fair, some of these late game resists and this one's late game power was actually meant as a solo queue versus pro skew lever. He's currently basically not in pro play at all. We acknowledge this will have actually some amount of elite versus low MR solo queue skew. I think we're willing to eat some of that, and that's fine. And it's really just trying to play down the amount of flat MR the champion has, which can just make a lot of mages feel non-functional against him. That is a long-winded way to say that, yeah, we are trying to lower the amount of passive MR in the game in places where it's too high. Finally, there is a compensation on the monster mod to the Q. 5 flat damage on Q in all cases, and it's plus 5 to 25 damage by rank on the monster mod on Q. This means his, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth clear are all going to be faster, but he's always going to deal less damage, and from level 11 onwards, he's going to be less durable. Pyke is a small nerf here. Pyke is one of the steeper mastery curves. This champion is relatively elite skewed and is, in my opinion, a little bit overperformant in support right now. And so just taking a small nerf to Pyke, the champion where, again, his win rate can rest below 50% and be a balanced champion, and that is fine. Not going after his damage so much right now. I think his damage is in a pretty appropriate state. I think just like Pyke's ability to kill is about appropriate here. I don't think it should go any higher. I don't think it should go any lower. I think this champion's a little bit too strong, so trying to find levers that are reasonable and that can hopefully tap down some frustration. And so this is the amount of access he has to going invisible, which I think is actually very, very high. It's very spammable. Pyke's mana costs are really kind of fake, and so I'd like to put one on W. His ability to bypass wards, other kind of things, and so, tapping this down. Seraphine is around somewhere between 51.5 and 52% win rate bot laner, and around 49.5 at support. Now, generally speaking, a lot of enchanters can live, 50.5 if they're like really mage heavy. This is like where Morgana kind of lives. This is where Lux kind of lives. This is below where Nami and Janna are, who are like more enchantery. But the more magey you are, the lower your win rate gets to go relative to like the enchanter curve. Generally speaking, then you have like champs like Melee who have a really high ban rate, even with a really 50% win rate. Anyway, whatever. The changes from 0.2 or whatever did a really, really, really good job of fixing Seraphine's, or at least closing massively the gap between Seraphine bot lane and Seraphine support to where we finally have room to buff Seraphine support if we want to without sort of like giga elo inflating Seraphine bot lane. I don't think we will ever get Seraphine bot lane to 50% win rate. I don't even think she needs that 50% win rate. I think her outputs are going to make her fix some team comps and have some situational uses that are totally fine, and it's totally reasonable to have this like 1% pick rate enchanter bot laner who's like pretty good sometimes. I think it's okay. So trying to go for changes that are satisfaction positive, that play up what Seraphine players would like, without trying to completely break the bank on role skew, because we are still somewhat ceilinged by role skew. So it's just flat Q AP ratio. This gives her some wave clear. This gives her, just straight up trading power as a support overall. One thing that's interesting to note is that the gold per game for Seraphine support versus Seraphine bot is actually pretty close together. It's close together than any other champion with like a support versus not support sort of role acquisition here, which means gold scaling changes to Seraphine can actually be less skewed than it would be for other champions overall, which is nice. It's a good thing overall. So yeah, it's kind of the hope here is that the AP ratio change is not significantly bot lane skewed, but it's the kind of thing that Seraphine players want. Because they want to generally deal damage. What they want to point out is I've seen people bring up that like, oh man, Seraphine's only viable builds are pure enchanter. That doesn't appear to be true. Even looking at only like high MR, like Masters Plus Seraphine players, the vast majority of Seraphine bot players and Seraphine support players, and explicitly high elo Seraphine bot support players, are building almost exclusively Seraphs, Embrace, and Leandries. So, you know, Seraphine is clearly building full AP for most players and for most skilled players. That is fine. That can be a core build. The goal is not to have Staff Flowing Water overtake as core build, but to simply be a viable option. That is currently true. Right now for Seraphine support, Qmax, Wmax, and Emax are all pretty close together in power level. Most of them max Q. That's not a big surprise, but a decent portion aren't. Around a quarter to a third of Seraphine support players are maxing not Q first, which means there is a real market for Seraphine players who are trying to, like, you know, sort of forge their own path and build their own build style. And it's like, that's great. Successful so far. I think so far we are hugely serving Seraphine support players, which is, and has always been from literally day one, been her primary audience and is always going to be the core focus. We're nerfing Talia. We are trying to nerf Talia in mid more than nerfing her in jungle. Simple 10 mana cost increase on Q, and then a very light AP ratio nerf on the Q monster mod, trying to tap down Talia's mid-game jungle clear speed. Talia is definitely one of the best junglers in the game. It's probably still going to be pretty true. That said, giving some value toward hey, having game-to-game variance and having some viable mage junglers, choosing to leave Talia on the strong side in jungle. We're intentionally leaving Talia on the strong side in jungle because, hey, not every jungler's gonna be a fighter. Not every jungler's gonna be a tank. There's like 3 viable mages. One of them is Brand, one of them is Talia, one of them is Karthus. Talia is going to be probably slightly stronger than Brand, and I'm actually not sure she's going to be better than Karthus now in high elo, but still relatively close, which, again, I think is reasonable here. But going a little bit more after her in mid, because there are a lot of control mages in mid, and she's extremely performant there, and of course also a big pro play stable, which is not really part of the reason we're doing this, but it just happens to be true. For Twitch, we are nerfing the bonus attack damage on R by 10. We are nerfing his base health by around 50, but increasing his health growth by around 4. The break even is level 15 here. The health change is not meant to be power neutral. It's meant to be a nerf, but compared to a regular nerf, which would be like, oh, 50 health, that's like 1.2% win rate. It's 50 health with compensation. It's going to be under 1% win rate. So 2 things here. 1, trying to siphon some power off of Twitch R. Explicitly, W ratio. Trying to siphon some power off of R, because I think Twitch just being an ulti bot and just another late game hyper carry is a disservice to Twitch, who has a lot more things going on in his kit. And if we can buy power away from his extremely good early game bullying, and we can buy power away from his just late game hyper carry multiplication, we can give him power in ways that are uniquely Twitch, that make him a more unique champion, that can hopefully make him a more fun champion, where Twitch often has a very, very, very high win rate and isn't very popular compared to other extremely strong hyper carry 80 carries. So basically nerfing the R hyper carry profile to give us room to buff him somewhere else down the line if he's ever going to need it. In PvE for a little while, this was minus 20 AD, we're going down to minus 10, and instead tweaking a little bit of minus health as well. Right now, Twitch is meaningfully elite skewed. Any early game nerf and late game compensation is going to be an elite skewed nerf overall. So R is going to be fairly flat, especially one that's a flat nerf that's, you know, full effect at level 6. As well as a, again, early game versus late game skew here on Twitch. This will actually still make him one of these slightly more durable marksmen. He still has fairly inflated armor, but he's now got what I consider to be kind of average-ish base health. Just slightly high armor, meaning he's still going to be on the slightly strong side, but not like practically the tankiest 80 carry at level 1. Keep in mind that I think Twitch does actually have a meaningful amount of early game agency. His stealth is incredibly inexpensive and very long duration. It's 10 seconds rank 1. It costs 40 mana, which means Twitch has a lot of access to just walk into a brush, either pretend you're pressing Q or not, and the enemy team has to respect you because Twitch's level 2 dueling is very, very, very strong, especially if you play with like a Lulu or a Milio or something, or a Yumi. I think Yumi is actually a pretty mediocre pairing, but like Lulu or Milio, where like they, or a Nami, where they can like really easily access their full kit power through Twitch, and Twitch just has target access. If you ever misstep, you kind of just die or lose flash. And if someone runs Ignite, you might just die anyway. So basically bringing down his dueling power, bringing down his power in a elite skewed manner, bringing down his hyper carry power, to that if we do happen to go, or magnitude, which I don't think we are, then we can give him power back in ways that are like more interesting to Twitch players specifically. Also, because we know we're taking down some AD carry specific strength in our bonus AD, we're nerfing the W AP ratio a very little bit as a bit of recompense on AP Twitch, because we don't want AP Twitch to become the best Twitch version, and it's relatively strong as well, and it has room to be nerfed a little bit. We're doing a very small nerf to Urgot. Urgot is currently low MMR skewed. He also has the 3rd highest level 18 armor in the game, which I don't think he needs. Like, yes, Urgot is, you know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, a juggernaut, but he is still somewhat ranged. He still has plenty of durability tools like his E, and so Urgot having the 3rd highest level 18 armor in the game, to me, not needed by any means. And also the fact that the champion is already low MMR skewed means that we can go after scaling stat nerfs, and those will be low MMR skewed as well, and so pretty easy change there. That's one of the patch. Hour 15 minutes long. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.